Ingredient lists are one of the most useful things on a beauty product, but they are also one of the most misunderstood. We're breaking it down today. It's Michelle of Lab Muffin Beauty Science, chemistry PhD, beauty nerd, and pronouncer of long words. Butyl methoxydibenzylmethane, trisodium ethylene diamine disuccinate. Today we're breaking down the home of long words, the ingredient list. I'm going to talk about what it tells us, what it doesn't tell us, and some tips on how to use it to choose products. I technically qualified as a cosmetic chemist in 2021 and I've tried a ton of products and I've dabbled in formulating. But my skills and experience are mostly in the understanding and research side of things. Most of my content is way more informed by my chemistry PhD background rather than my cosmetic chemistry diploma. So I've asked a bunch of cosmetic chemists who do more formulating how they use ingredient lists. Make sure you stick around for that. There are a bunch of rules that cosmetic ingredient lists in most countries need to follow. First off, the ingredient names. These are standardized names that come from the International Nomenclature of Cosmetic Ingredients, INCI or INCI. These are sort of like the generic names of drugs, like how ibuprofen is the generic name and then Nurofen is the brand name. And just like with ibuprofen, there are lots of different brand name ingredients that have the same generic INCI name, and that's the same name that ends up on the ingredient list. Often the one ingredient supplier will actually have lots of different brand name ingredients that have the same INCI name, and we will talk about why that is a bit later. A cosmetic formulator might be putting Optifen into their product, that is the brand name of a preservative, but then on the ingredient list, it'll get listed as phenoxyethanol and propylyl glycol. Or they might be using Allicel 165, which is an emulsifier, but that will get listed as glycerol stearate and PEG 100 stearate. Plant extracts are listed with their Latin botanical names as well as the bit of the plant that they come from. And sometimes, if the brand is feeling a bit nice, they'll add the common name in brackets. Rosehip seed oil might be listed as Rosa canina rosehip seed extract. I hate botanical names so much, I purposely picked that one because it looked relatively easy to pronounce, but I'm still not entirely sure I got that one right. Fragrance is usually listed under the umbrella term fragrance because it is often a trade secret. No, it is not because they're trying to secretly poison you. I know we like to think that we are all super objective, smart consumers who wouldn't be influenced by something as superficial as how a product smells. But in reality, the science shows that we are just really fooling ourselves, and the science also shows that we are really good at fooling ourselves. There are studies where the same product with different fragrances were judged to be different greasiness, different levels of cleaning, and this is called the halo effect. This is where one aspect of a product makes you assume things about other aspects, and this is a massive area of research because if you do get the smell right for a particular product, that can be the difference between selling okay versus an absolute smash hit, and you don't want to let your competitors know how to replicate that. These days, they can probably work it out if they try. You can analyze fragrances with chromatography, but it is a bit of a pain, and so at least this will make it harder for your competitors. A lot of fragrances use essential oils and they can be wrapped up under that same umbrella term of fragrance, but sometimes they are listed separately and again with their Latin botanical names.
Emotional damage!
Fragrances and essential oils often contain common allergens, and if those allergens are over a certain concentration, so the dose is high enough that it could potentially be risky for people who are already allergic, in some regions, like the EU, they need to be listed separately, and these are things like linalool and geraniol. I actually went to fragrance school in France a few months ago and I learned a whole bunch of stuff there. Let me know if you want me to do a video talking about fragrance science. Flavor or aroma is another similar umbrella term. That's usually for things like lip products where you might actually get some in your mouth. The next big rule is the order of ingredients. That is done in descending order, usually by weight, although some countries allow volume. That means that the first ingredient in the list is the one that you have the most of, and then it goes down to the least. And in most products, that top ingredient is going to be water. That's also sometimes listed as aqua, depending on where you live. There are a few exceptions to this order, and the most important one is that ingredients that are there at below 1% can be listed in any order. And here is where a little bit of marketing can start to creep into this list that seems like it should be pretty objective. For example, here is a body lotion that I made up for my book, The Science of Beauty. This video is based on a spread in it. If you want to get an overview of a lot of topics that I'm probably going to be covering over the next few years, check that out. These are all the ingredients, and these ones are the ones below 1%, so I have a bit of leeway there. If I'm a marketing person, I might put vitamin E, which is tocopherol, a bit higher so that it looks like there's more of that in the product. And then I might put fragrance and the allergen at the end so that it looks like there's less. Or I might move phenoxyethanol a little bit up so that it's buried more in the middle and it's harder to see because it does look like a scary, long, synthetic word. Another exception to this order is color additives. For makeup products, sometimes there's an eyeshadow range that has like 30 shades, and then only the color is changing, the base stays the same. It's just unnecessary hassle for there to be 30 different boxes with 30 different ingredient lists. It doesn't really give someone who's trying to buy eyeshadow much more useful information. So you might see may contain or plus/minus at the end of the list, and then a whole bunch of coloring agents listed in any order. One thing that's sometimes useful is looking for the 1% line in an ingredient list. Some ingredients are almost always used at less than 1%, so then if you have another ingredient that is under that, then you know that it's probably in there at less than 1%. Here are some of those ingredients. There's some preservatives, pH adjusters, fragrance, and this can be useful if there's an active that you want at more than 1%. So for example, if you want glycolic acid in a chemical exfoliant. So let's say you see an ingredient list that looks like this with glycolic acid under phenoxyethanol. For glycolic acid, you usually want that at maybe 5 or 10%. So this is below a whole bunch of ingredients that are usually at 1% or less. That means this probably wouldn't be a very good chemical exfoliant. This happens a lot with salicylic acid. It is a component of a lot of preservative mixes, so it's not really put in a lot of products as an exfoliant. There's also citric acid, which is a pH adjuster. It's in tons of products. So just because you see one of those in the ingredient list doesn't mean it was ever meant to be an exfoliating product. This also happens sometimes with products that have a big list of actives that it contains listed on the front. Usually, these products will have maybe a couple of actives that are in there at useful concentrations. The rest of the active ingredients are just sort of sprinkled in there in tiny amounts, just so the marketing can talk about these ingredients. So this can be a really useful way of checking if a product will actually do what you want it to do. But at the same time, there are lots of exceptions. These below 1% ingredients are sometimes used at higher concentrations, and there are lots of active ingredients that will work at lower percentages. If there's a good delivery system in the product, it can help the active work a lot more effectively, so you actually don't need as high a percentage. Retinol, for example, 1% is actually quite high. There are lots of good formulations that use less. So if retinol is below fragrance or preservatives, it could still be a really effective, powerful product. This leads me into a big misconception about so-called filler ingredients. And this is what some people call ingredients that aren't active or functional. Some people will tell you to look for products that have less of these because they are supposedly useless. But there's no real filler ingredients apart from water. Every other ingredient costs more than water, so there is a reason that those are added to the product. Ingredients are needed to achieve the right type of product. You need a thickener so that you can get a texture that is thick enough to actually get onto your face rather than something really, really watery. A lot of products need preservatives to make sure the product is protected against microbes, otherwise they grow too much and your product goes off, or antioxidants to stop oils in it from smelling rancid really quickly. Some ingredients are purposely in there to dilute the functional ingredients to the right level and help it spread, and this includes water, but this still isn't useless. If you've tried enough bad products or tried formulating your own products, you will quickly notice that more actives and less fillers doesn't usually mean better. You don't want to burn your face off with an exfoliating acid or have a clump of cleanser that's stuck to your skin that takes like 3 minutes to dilute enough to actually bubble up. Or you don't want a super patchy, intensely pigmented blush that just doesn't have enough filler to help those pigments spread out and actually blend in nicely. Now onto what the ingredient list doesn't tell you, and this is something that I feel very strongly about, and every cosmetic chemist that I talked to really emphasized and made sure that I talked about. There is a lot that you can't tell from the ingredient list. There is a lot of ingredient list overuse, maybe ingredient list abuse, a lot of science washing when it comes to ingredient lists. It is really tempting to overanalyze the ingredient list because it does feel objective and sciencey, and it is useful to an extent. But you can't actually tell that much about the product from an ingredient list. It isn't meant to tell you everything. Companies do not want their competitors to be able to copy their products that easily. This ingredient list system was set up as a compromise that gives consumers some vital information, but it doesn't give too much away. This system was intentionally designed to be ambiguous. First off, you can't tell if a product works just from the ingredient list. You can't review a product just from looking at that list. If you try the product and look at the claims on the packaging and look at the ingredient list, that is so much more helpful. But those websites that claim to use AI and algorithms to analyze the ingredient list and then tell you exactly which products really work and which ones you need to buy with their affiliate links, or viral videos where people are saying this product is good, this one is bad, this one is definitely a complete dupe of this one, just based on the ingredient list, unless it is a really, really unusually simple product, that is going to be BS. The ingredient list is essentially a recipe that only has rough quantities. Cake batter, a good cake, and a burnt cake all have the exact same components and actually in the same quantities. It's the same for products. The actual quantities, the grades of the ingredients, and how those ingredients are arranged in the product are really important to how well it works. With quantity, the list just gives the descending order, so the second ingredient could be 20%, 10%, 4%, 1%, and it could still have the same ingredient list, even though the actual product would be really different. There's something that cosmetic formulators often do called reverse engineering, which is essentially just trying to dupe a product. This isn't just done to formulate a dupe and then sell it, it's usually done to try to understand how the product works, like how they got a particular texture, and then maybe incorporate some of those ideas into their own formulas. Reverse engineering is simply not that easy, even with the ingredient list in hand and the formulator understanding how ingredients and products work. Having to work out actual quantities is one of the big hurdles, of course, but it is also to do with ingredient grades. This is something that a lot of people don't realize about cosmetic products and something that is really different from generic drug names. The same INCI name doesn't mean that it's exactly the same identical ingredient with the same effects and properties. INCI names are usually a lot more like cooking ingredients. A lot of INCI names are actually umbrella names. They might look quite sciencey and technical, but a lot of the time they are as specific as just the word cheese. There are a lot of different types of cheese that will have very different effects on a recipe. Let's say you're making a cheesecake. Probably don't want to use blue cheese. One obvious example is with natural plant extracts. The actual chemical composition depends on tons of factors. Where the plant is grown, the exact cultivar, how the extract is processed, how long it's been sitting around. It's the same with fruit. If you have red grapes and green grapes and raisins and wine and moldy grapes, they are all really different, but on an ingredient list, they would all be listed the same. Vitis vinifera fruit extract. For skincare, there are some licorice extracts that have a lot of brightening actives, but then also some that don't. Some plant oils have much more antioxidants than others, and you can see the difference in the color. A lot of the time, that color is coming from antioxidants. But it isn't just these natural products, it's also the case for more scientific sounding names too that sound like maybe they're a chemical compound. Some ingredients are actually umbrella names, so for example, cetyl alcohol is actually a mixture of cetyl and stearyl alcohols, and these can be in different proportions. Dimethicone is another example. That is a polymer. It's made up of lots of units that are joined into a chain. But depending on how many units you have, how long the chain is, it can have a really different effect, but it's still going to be listed as dimethicone. Really short chains are lightweight and really runny. Longer chains are a lot heavier and they can get almost sticky. And then you also have everything else in between. It's the same with the term hydrolyzed proteins on an ingredient list. Hydrolysis just means the protein's been chopped up. It doesn't tell you how big the chopped up bits are. In hair products, for example, if you have different sizes of proteins, they can have really different effects on your hair. There's also how the ingredients are physically structured inside the product, how they're arranged. So for example, you can make almost any color of sparkly pigment with thin layers of titanium dioxide. I talked about this in my pigments video. The color just depends on how thick the layer is. That's why almost every sparkly makeup product has titanium dioxide. Then we have sunscreens. Titanium dioxide in sunscreens is in little solid particles. They protect against UV and they give a bit of a white cast. The amount of cast and the SPF can be very different depending on what the particles are like, even if you have the same percentage. And then in foundations, we also have titanium dioxide. It's in much bigger particles and is purposely there to be white. It's called pigmentary titanium dioxide. It actually acts as pigment. It adds coverage to the foundation. And then if we go to the next level, we might have a foundation that has a glowy golden shimmer and SPF, and it's also got coverage. So you might have all of these types of titanium dioxide. Surfactants in shampoos and cleansers are another important example. I talked about it in this video. Just changing the ratios of the surfactants, the same surfactants, can make a massive difference to how the product is structured, which can take it from really harsh on your skin to really mild. There's also synergistic ingredient combinations, so delivery systems. We have encapsulation. This is really common for skincare ingredients. It's where the active ingredient is sort of wrapped up inside another material before it gets put into the product. But a lot of the materials used to form that encapsulating layer are also used as ingredients for other reasons. Long story short, everything gets complicated pretty quickly. All my examples were just for like 1 to maybe 3 ingredients. You can imagine what happens when we have a standard product which might have, 10 to 30 ingredients. All of this also means that you can't tell if 2 products are identical dupes that are going to perform the same way just based on an ingredient list. If 2 products have the same ingredient list, then they were probably designed to be dupes, but if the brands are different, they aren't going to be able to copy the formula exactly. Even if they are brands under the same umbrella company, from speaking to people who work at these companies, they aren't going to release the same product under different brands. That is just not how the company and the formulation processes are structured. One thing that ingredient lists are super useful for is spotting when a brand doesn't really know what they're doing. If a brand is cutting corners when it comes to getting an ingredient list that looks correct, that is like not a very hard thing to do, they are probably also cutting corners with a lot of other more difficult stuff. Maybe safety, maybe hygiene, maybe stability testing. That product might not be manufactured safely, or it might have unsafe amounts of ingredients, and this happens a lot with things like irritants and allergens, things like essential oils. It might just go moldy really quickly, or it might simply just not be formulated in a way that will actually work. Getting ingredients right is just so much easier than actually getting the formulation right. On to the tips that you were waiting for. How do cosmetic chemists use ingredient lists? I talked to some of my favorite cosmetic chemists for this. Make sure you follow them for really great tips. What do you actually use the ingredients list for when you're deciding on a product?
I usually use ingredient lists to make sure that the brand is following basic regulations. Is there a drug fact panel where there should be? Are there things that are spelled correctly, are listed properly? And you'd be surprised how many brands don't have their aisles in the correct order or they don't list them properly. And that's usually a big red flag to me.
I use the ingredients list to kind of back up the marketing on the front of a packaging. What actives are backing that claim? What delivery system realistically are we looking at for those actives?
It ultimately depends on what my concern is. Fundamentally, at the very basic level, I'm looking for the ingredients that are going to form that basic function. If I'm looking for a shampoo, I'm going to be looking for surfactants to cleanse my hair. Or if I'm looking for a moisturizer, I'm going to be looking for humectants or occlusives or emollients to have that basic function. If I want a serum, I'm going to be looking for something that has brightening agents in it, so like licorice extract or like alpha-arbutin or something like that.
If there's a specific ingredient that is being claimed, I might have a look at where it's positioned on the ingredient list, but it's kind of challenging to even get to insights about where the ingredient will be just based off of that 1% rule. A gauge that I'll often have is phenoxyethanol. I know the regulatory limit is 1%. They're not going to put it above that. If that's higher, then it's probably lower, but the other thing that I keep in mind is that's not going to make me not buy the product because sometimes ingredients perform very well at low concentrations. I typically will look for claims more than I'll look to ingredient lists, but I look at ingredients more out of I'm just interested.
One big misconception that I see with people reading ingredient lists is that they think it tells you everything you need to know about a product. There's so much more to it than just the ingredients on the list. Another misconception is that ingredients have to be high up on that ingredient list for them to be effective. There's so many ingredients that work below that 1% level, so it doesn't tell you everything you need to know.
With brightening, I'm looking at knowing the mechanism of really what you want to look at for targeting the appearance of pigmentation, because I don't want to see a brightening serum that has one single active that really focuses on pigmentation. I want a cocktail. So I'm really saying, in terms of the marketing claims, am I getting all the bang for my buck realistically?
If they're advertising some benefit, like you said, brightening serum, and they're using vitamin C, I want it to be at efficacious level because vitamin C, niacinamide, most of the brightening ingredients except for retinol have to be 5 to 20% depending on the active. And if it's less than 1%, below that 1% line, after the preservatives, after the fragrance, I'm this is one of those extract situations where they're oh, hey, it does this. We have all these ingredients, but none of them are at use level. So I'm okay, yeah, I'm not trusting that product.
The way that I usually use an ingredient list is to verify or back up the marketing claims. If a formula claims that it has retinol, I want to make sure that retinol actually appears on the ingredient list and it's not a derivative. There's nothing wrong with derivatives, but I just want to make sure that the marketing and the ingredient list are saying the same thing.
There's so many different vitamin C and retinol derivatives out on the market, and we don't really know from marketing only which ones we're getting. So I'll normally turn it around and kind of see what a specific derivative I'm getting. And if there's one that I like better, I'll usually gravitate towards that.
You really see a lot of reaching from brands. There was a brand recently that launched a retinol serum. Retinol was nowhere on the ingredients list. Instead, it was a retinol ester. And so it's kind of like, oh, like disappointing a little bit.
There are some complexes in raw materials that as a formulator can recognize. So if there's one that I particularly like, either an active or an emulsifier that I've previously worked with, I'd be more inclined to give the product a try.
There's so many different ways you can encapsulate an ingredient, but at the same time, they all use very similar components to do that. I can usually pick out like, oh, this is encapsulated in that way. And then from there, I can go backwards and work out what the actual ingredient is through supply information and everything like that.
If I'm sensitive or allergic to something, I want to make sure like it's not in the formula. I'm sensitive to phenoxyethanol, not to the point where it can't be in the formula, but I'm very picky and choosy. I'm like, okay, I might need to patch test this. I know ideally we should patch test everything. Of course, we're human. We're not all patch testing everything. But if it has phenoxyethanol or something, or fragrance, a lot of fragrance, I'll definitely patch test that just to be on the safe side.
This might be harder for a normal consumer to decipher, but seeing if a formula is worth the price point, and it's usually really hard to tell how much a formula is just based on the IL or whether it's effective. But there are some formulas out there where when I look at the IL, I think to myself, I can definitely get this for far less. One that comes to mind is like Dr. Barbara Sturm's hyaluronic acid serum. It's such a basic formula, but it's like $300. And for me, that is a hard pass.
Let's say you see a brightening serum or a shampoo or whatever product category you like that's maybe trending on social media. How would you go about deciding if you're going to buy it? Do you ever buy products just based off the ingredients list, or what else do you look at?
I never buy products just based off of ingredient lists because I know there's a lot of variability, even if the ingredient lists are the same between two products, and how the product will actually perform, what the texture will be like. There's a lot that goes into manufacturing the product that can make a difference for the end aesthetics.
I generally do try to get a tester rather than base a purchase completely on the ingredient list.
I don't really tend to shop for products solely based off the ingredient list. I do think other things tend to appeal to me sometimes. How the brand markets the product, the packaging sometimes does appeal to me. If the brand has done any clinical testing, I look at multiple aspects before deciding to purchase a product. The ingredient list isn't like the end all or be all for me personally.
I don't ever just buy based off the ingredient list. I usually use the ingredient list in conjunction with the claims associated with the product.
I'll usually purchase based off of claims, and especially if there's any reviews or if there's any testing that I see on the product, that's more interesting to me for actually purchasing a product.
There's always like the caveat that ingredient list doesn't tell you everything. When I was reverse engineering formulas for my second contract manufacturer job, ingredient list was very simple. It's like dimethicones and cross polymers. It's like a liquid satin lip. And it was so hard to replicate. There are so many different types of certain ingredients, like different types of dimethicone, different grades of cellulose gum, different types of xanthan gum. So the ingredient list doesn't really tell you much about the texture of a product. It doesn't really tell you about like the full picture.
If the claims sound way too good to be true, I will usually do a little bit more investigation before purchasing it. Things like looking at the IL or seeing if a brand has done clinicals to support their claims that they are making on social media.
A big one for me is like anti-aging claims. There's like not a lot of really good in vivo ways of making sure that like this product does deliver on these anti-aging claims. It's one thing to have an ingredients list that has these actives, have these claims around, for example, pigmentation, and you can actually do a really quick brand clinical. Over 8 weeks, users saw an improvement in the appearance of pigmentation. When it comes to other actives though, like for example, anti-aging claims, it's harder to get a lot of that data. And a lot of brands actually don't even do the clinicals. They just take manufacturer studies and claims. And those studies were done actually ex vivo. So usually you take like a piece of excised skin to like Someone got a tummy tuck, that extra skin, we use that for penetration studies. If we see that this specific raw material inhibits MMP, for example, that's an enzyme that degrades collagen, we can then do A plus B equals C and say like, oh, well, this ingredient, therefore it's anti-aging. And if it's in this product, it's an anti-aging product. They didn't actually do any clinicals to prove it necessarily or any studies. They're just going off of supplier data. And that's another thing where it's like, I can't actually prove it's going to be anti-aging. Therefore, is it really worth it? You can't gauge worth it just off of an ingredients list. You want to make sure like the product itself is going to work. I'm not a big fan of peptides as another example. You have to do a lot of work to make sure the peptides can get to where they need to go to signal whatever they need to signal. That's another category of marketing claims and ingredients lists might not actually equal each other.
I think reviews can also be really helpful. I have a couple of people that I think are my skin twins, and generally things that they like tend to work out well for me. So I look for recommendations that way as well.
Are there any things that you see on an ingredient list that end up being deal breakers for you?
A deal breaker for me is if I see a non-compliant ingredient list. And this is something that I have seen frequently enough, especially from smaller brands, trade names for the ingredients on their ingredient list. So they should be using INCI nomenclature. Then that's a serious red flag that they don't have the skills to safely put a product on the market.
If the ingredient list is not listed correctly, that is an absolute deal breaker. Repeating ingredients throughout the aisle and it just is not consolidated.
If it's not a compliant ingredient list, that is a huge red flag and I would not buy the product. I'm not going to buy products off TikTok shop with no skincare, no Amazon, no Etsy's. I can't trust that those businesses are following regulations compared to, like, let's say, the conglomerates. They try not to get sued.
When a brand claims to have a product that's preservative free, that's like a little bit of a red flag, but not a deal breaker until I look into that product. Water-based products need preservatives, and so if it truly doesn't have a preservative, that's a deal breaker for me.
If I don't see a preservative system, that is usually a hard pass for me. I will not purchase the product. I think with a trained eye, you can kind of see whether a preservative system is strong enough or not. Like I'll usually look for a chelating agent just to see if they've really protected the formula well enough.
For me, I'm not saying like an ingredient and I'm like, no. If I see a lack of ingredients that, again, don't back up the marketing claim, to me, I'm like, why am I investing in this product? I don't look at so much the ingredients list. I look at all the other factors behind a product, like the sensory, the feel, the smell. There's no deal breaker ingredients for me personally, I don't think.
I don't have any sensitivities or allergies, and so I'm open to trying everything. There's not one ingredient that I'm like, oh, I'm not going to use a product because of that.
I feel like I'm like one of the lucky ones. Like I'm not acne prone. Like I don't tend to have reactions. I can pretty much like use anything. If you have seen a specialist and know like what your allergies are, then the ingredient list is like a good starting point to like know what to avoid. But other than that, it's not really telling you a lot. It's like a preview of a book. It doesn't tell you anything. You have to like read the book / use the product to fully understand if it's going to work for you or not.
There aren't any ingredients that just make me go like, no, I don't want that, except for the ones I'm sensitive to, because I think every ingredient has its place. Like even things like talc, which I've talked about several times. Like I'm okay with talc and makeup. I'm cool with most of the stuff that's already on the market.
When it comes to ingredients and deal breakers, it's on brands to be doing the right thing and adding in ingredients that are safe for use and within the levels that are considered safe for cosmetics. So like I trust that brands are doing that.
I will usually see if the claims match up with the aisle. Sometimes I feel like the claims are a little bit too out there for what is in the formula.
I don't think I'd call this a deal breaker, but something that does make me a little bit skeptical of a formula is when it has a really long and massive ingredient list, especially when there's like 20 or 30 different plant extracts. It can be pretty challenging to formulate with an effective or high concentration of a large variety of ingredients. It tends to make me wonder if those ingredients have been included more for marketing claims than actual benefits or skin benefits.
It's more so like the marketing that can tend to be a deal breaker. So for example, I've seen like brands claim 5% retinol and it ends up being like a retinol complex, which is like really misleading because the percentage of retinol is 0.2% or like lower. And there's other things that are carrying in that complex that is making the marketing deem it 5%.
Are there things that you see on an ingredient list that make you think, yes, I'm probably going to really like this product?
If it has silicones in it, I know I'll probably like it, whether it comes to hair or skincare. I'm just a really big fan of silicones. The same goes for sulfates when it comes to clarifying shampoos.
I love to see humectants within like the first 5 ingredients because I know having oily skin, loving a really hydrating product, that's more in my wheelhouse of I will enjoy this.
There's some ingredients that I do like and look out for things like ascorbic acid, retinol, niacinamide, petrolatum even, and glycerin, hyaluronic acid. Those are all ingredients that work pretty well for my skin. The issue is that just seeing them on an ingredient list isn't necessarily really going to inform me whether or not that this formula is actually going to work well for me.
So if it's a cleanser, a hydrating cleanser, I would like to see humectants really high up, like glycerin among like the first five ingredients. Love that. I'd like to see conditioning agents. I love seeing that in some lotions, in some cleansers, because that lets me know it's going to be substantive to the skin. For moisturizers, I like seeing things like ceramides for, building the barrier.
I like petrolatum in my lip balms. It's a really nice occlusive, and especially like sometimes they mix it with like humectants like panthenol and glycerin. I tend to really like those lip balms because I know that they're going to work. And especially if I'm buying with some of the larger brands who use these ingredients, I know I like those products. But for other products, I mean, there's just so much variability from formulation to formulation. So not really.
There's not one ingredient that makes me decide that I'm going to love a product. It's emulsifiers, it's oils, it's a thickener. Because for me, like the sensory aspect is really important, as well as delivering results, because I want to enjoy being able to use the product. I do love seeing niacinamide on the list just because it works well for my skin. But I know it's not that one ingredient that will make the product work for me. It's the whole aspect of it.
Not trending ingredients, but ingredients that I'm really into. So right now for me, that's Ectowin. If I see Ectowin on ingredients list, I get really excited just because I love Ectowin. The raw material supplier I worked at before was a big producer of Ectowin. There was a lot of research and a lot of work I did. Well, I did the work, I didn't do the research behind the ingredients. So it's just a fun ingredient to see.
As a formulator, I'm a huge texture person, and this might be shocking, but sometimes I buy a product for the texture only because I like to study it and see how I can recreate it in my lab. I'll usually look for clues like magnesium sulfate that will hint to me that this is a reverse emulsion. And I love reverse emulsions, especially water and silicone. I love those textures.
I always have dehydrated skin, so like the more humectants the better. This is maybe a little bit weird, but I'm always interested in trying out new acids and like exfoliating ingredients.
I would say sometimes lecithin, but I don't necessarily like the feel of it in every product. But when formulated well, I can really like that second skin feel of a lecithin in a formula as well.
Honestly, no. I'm going to be honest. I'm really about like trying the product first, because I feel like the ingredient list, it may initially appeal to me. So for example, if I were to go for a brightening serum and I see they have all those brightening actives and the texture ends up being horrible, superficially, like, yeah, that looks great. But once I try the texture and it's not something I would want to apply every day to treat my concern, then
Ingredient lists are only one part of choosing products. Check out my skincare science playlist for more analysis. I have some deep dives on specific ingredients like vitamin C and retinoids. More of those will be coming. Thank you so much to the chemists who collaborated with me. Make sure you follow them, they are fantastic.